for this introduction. Lars, if you want, you can already start sharing your presentation. Lars is currently a professor at the Moen Center for Innovation and Regional Development at the Western Norway University for Applied Sciences. He studied in Eindhoven and in Maastricht very much already on the nexus between innovation and transitions, and he worked as well in the last years at Lund University, at TNO, and very recently at the University of Melbourne before he moved back with the family to Europe. Today, what you're going to learn is the following. Lars will give us a spatial history about sustainability transitions research that has occurred over the last decades, and also he will talk about the discovery of space in transitions altogether. And he will give us a good overview of the common themes in the geography of transitions literature, and he will obviously as well give us an outlook of what's going to happen in the next years and where he sees where most research is needed. So with no further ado, you know, I like this sentence, with no further ado, I would like to give this stage to Lars. And Lars, we're very happy to have you today, and please give us a good overview of the geographies of transitions.
Okay, thanks, Julius, and yeah, I'll give it my best. Now, welcome everyone. I'm here in Bergen, as Julius already was saying, where it's raining. It's not much of a surprise. As you can see on the picture, this is how Bergen looks like during the day. It can be pretty grim around November time, but things are lightening up now with the Christmas coming on. So I've interpreted this talk quite literal, as really trying to give an introduction to the geography of sustainability transitions. And it'll be therefore quite panoramic and on a sort of a high level of abstraction. And I already want to flag now that I'm happy to take any questions, and if you want to have any empirical sort of illustrations, to take those in the Q&A. Let's see. Move my slides. Oh, yeah, there we go. So, as Julius also already was saying, I've had a sort of a mixed background. I'd like to sort of refer there back to the talk of Nikki Franciskaki at the previous session, that a lot of transition scholars have sort of a T-shaped profile. And my T sort of consists on the one hand of one leg that comes from a sort of a spatial, a geographical background, and one leg that comes from a innovation studies, science technology studies background. And I started to engage with sustainability transitions really as an early career researcher myself. In fact, I wasn't engaging with this literature during my PhD, but only during my postdoctoral years. Where I, as an economic geographer, became increasingly interested in, if you like, the geography of clean tech industry and environmental innovation. And because of that interest, I quite quickly ended up with the, at that time, emerging literature on sustainability transitions that was being pioneered very much by scholars coming out of the Netherlands, like Frank Geels, Rob Grave, Johan Schot, René Kemp, John Grin, etc., etc. And just to sort of explain why I got sort of caught by sustainability transitions, and that is because, to my knowledge, it's one of the sort of really sort of excellent frameworks and bodies of literature that deals with the Janus phase of innovation. In innovation studies proper, as I sort of was working on during my PhD, there's a lot of focus on drivers of innovation, and there's a lot of focus on the sort of the positive impact of innovation. And I thought it was really fascinating with sustainability transitions work that they both looked at sort of the resistance against innovation, what makes sort of change inert and slow, and at the same time looking at its drivers. And I think that's sort of quite nicely captured by this picture. All right, so I started to engage with sustainability transitions around 2008, 2009, and I think this picture from a paper from Jochen Markart and colleagues and editorial and research policy sort of paints pretty well what the state of transition research was looking like theoretically at that time. And I think you could even say that not that much has happened. I mean, a lot has happened in terms of refinement and improvements, but I'd probably argue that these are still the 4 key concepts or frameworks that are being used in transition research. But it also shows that it's important to sort of acknowledge the path dependence of transitions research, and that these concepts, transition management, strategic niche management, the multi-level perspective, and TIS, they have sort of a prehistory and sort of have their roots in innovation studies, evolutionary economics, institutional studies, and STS. Now, back in 2011, in Lund, we organized the second International Sustainability Transitions Conference. And I had the opportunity to give sort of a reflection at the end of this conference. And I started to talk about donuts. And I use that metaphor because in economic geography, we often like to compare our subdiscipline with that of a donut. A donut that reflects that the discipline is very diverse, that it's moving in all kinds of directions. It has a very sort of broad orbit, dealing with very many sort of different theoretical concepts, empirical phenomenon, but that there is a risk that sort of the core of the subdiscipline becomes hollowed out. So there's not really sort of something that unites economic geographers, and that kind of can sometimes be quite problematic. And back in 2011, I was wondering, is this also going to happen to transition studies? And I would say, no, it didn't. I think, it's really a good case of a donut that kind of kept a yummy core, in the sense of being, this is a famous donut from Melbourne, a Nutella donut, where still a lot of the transitions literature relates back to key concepts such as TIS, MLP, SNM, and TM. And I think that partly also explains why there's really sort of a coherence, and there's sort of a lively debate within this community. But talking about geography, I think before I start to elaborate on, say, the geography of transitions, I thought it would be useful to maybe spend a few minutes sort of explaining what it means to sort of, think like a geographer. I mean, I'm very much in favor of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research. That's, in a sense, also how I started myself. But at the same time, it can kind of sometimes be difficult to have a ontological and an epistemological foundation, because you're sort of putting together a whole mishmash of theories, concepts, and literatures. And I found it quite rewarding to actually find a disciplinary home in geography, because that allowed me to sort of, have a history of thought and some sort of traditions to build on, even though, geography is a very eclectic discipline. So as an economic geographer, we tend to be interested in the study of the location, the distribution, and the spatial organization of economic activities across the world. And to sort of draw back on the work of my former supervisor, Björn Asheim, it is very much a synthetic discipline, just like history. So geographers and historians often sort of tend to draw on theories from other social science, such as political science, sociology, economics, etc., and apply that to make sense of spatial phenomena. So what geographers often tend to do is they contextualize the social world to say, why do economies look differently in the US compared to, say, Sweden? Because of that sort of synthetic nature, the discipline and the geographical perspective has quite a lot of theoretical and methodological flexibility, while at the same time often, being quite strongly grounded in empirical research. And as I said earlier, at the same time, that sort of flexibility creates a risk that as a discipline, it can also become somewhat sort of incoherent. Now, within economic geography, there's both sort of a standing tradition of doing research on geography of innovation. And that's sort of what I was initially working with when I was doing my PhD. And typically, geographers are then interested in questions around, the agglomeration of innovation. Why are innovation activities concentrated unevenly and sort of peaking in certain locations? And many of you know, of course, the phenomenon of Silicon Valley as being sort of a real hotbed of innovation and high-tech industry in the world. And that is something that economic geographers are very much sort of interested in, and also developed a whole suite of concepts and frameworks to make sense of that sort of uneven distribution of innovation activity, all the way from industrial districts to clusters to innovative milieux, technopoles, learning regions, you name it. Now, sort of a bigger kind of question within that discussion is around, what drives those agglomeration advantages? Is that sort of similarity of industries and firms and economic agents, which is captured by the notion of localization advantages and the proximity advantages that they give? Or is it more around sort of the diversity of agglomerations, which you typically find in large cities? And in recent years, evolutionary economic geography has sort of tried to provide a sort of a middle ground there by concepts such as related variety. Another, of course, phenomenon that geographers are very much interested in is the globalization of innovation, how knowledge and other resources for innovation flow across space. And again, there's a sort of a well-known literature to draw on around global production networks and global value chains. And to just sort of conclude on this, there's also been really sort of a happy marriage, if you like, between economic geographers and innovation studies through concepts such as regional innovation systems and global innovation networks. Now, I earlier mentioned that what geographers tend to do is to contextualize things. And I now sort of really want to start with talking about the geography of sustainability transitions by contextualizing the origins of these fields. And I kind of recently revisited my master thesis back from 1998, which was dealing with a Dutch policy program called Sustainable Technology Development. And in that policy program, there was a graph that looks very similar to a graph that was recently sort of put in an OECD report around system innovation and transitions. So right now we can really see that the field is becoming really quite popular and is being really sort of taken up by policymakers at a global level. I think if you make it into the OECD, that means that you're becoming pretty mainstream. But take 30 years ago, transition policy and transition thinking was still very much sort of a Dutch phenomenon. And this Sustainable Technology Development Policy Program, I would argue, had a lot of sort of precedents that we now find in transition studies. It was trying to see how technology development can be used to foster sustainable development. It was very much in the Brundtland era through really paradigmatic shifts, system innovations, if you like. It was already acknowledging that this involves co-evolution between, at that time, is kind of quite roughly described as structure, culture, and technology. But it also already acknowledged the importance of path dependency, inertia, the difficulty to establish sort of system innovations, and how inert or how stable existing configurations often are. At the same time, it very much sort of focused on sort of the agentic qualities and sort of the social shaping of innovation. And it tried to sort of do that by really focusing on the long-term future visions around sort of sustainable blueprints for the future. And in that sort of policy program, they've also really pioneered the notion of backcasting and how backcasting is sort of brought to life through socio-technical experimentation. So this is all sort of, from around the mid-1990s, but I think it's sort of, it has quite some resonance with the terminology that we use today. quite quickly after the Sustainable Technology Development Program, the Dutch sort of introduced the KSI network. And I think we really need to acknowledge that if we want to understand sustainability transitions research. This was the Knowledge Network for System Innovation and Transitions. And it brought together 10 Dutch universities and TNO. And it really sort of, I think, paved the way for a lot of the intellectual origins of transitions research. The MLP, SNM, TM, TIS, they all sort of found their origins there through the work of Marco Heckert, Frank Keel, so a lot of the people that you saw in the slides earlier on. And what was also typical of this program was that it really engaged with practitioners and policymakers. So besides sort of having a very impressive intellectual legacy, I think there were 37 PhD theses, the establishment of AIST, the establishment of the IST conference, the establishment of STRN, I think also the way that transitions research tries to engage with policy and practice was very much sort of formed by KSI and by sort of the Dutch model of doing research. I think this is even sort of formally sort of picked up by Stefan Kuhlmann in a commentary on sustainability transitions, that it very much reflects a Dutch style of doing research, which is both sort of theoretically cutting edge, but at the same time very pragmatic and very much geared to making change happen. And I think that is something that still very much sort of resonates with, you know, now even sustainability transitions research has gone global. The transition incumbents at that time were often quite cheerful and a bit sort of self-congratulatory about the impact they were making on policy. Others sort of, you know, observing transition research and transition policy from the outside were a bit more skeptical about sort of the impact, the societal impact that transition research was making at that time. But to make this, to sort of, you know, to wrap up this story, this sort of spatial history of sustainability transition research, what also happened is that because of that strong sort of concentration of research in the Netherlands and a strong focus on, you know, how to engage with policy making, it also created the what we would start to call the sort of methodological nationalism of a lot of transition research. In the same time as Jochen and colleagues wrote this piece in 2012, they also did sort of a review of the field and found that there was a real strong sort of bias towards national framings in the majority of transition papers. Or there was simply no sort of spatial framing, and if there was a spatial framing, it was primarily national. And asking at that time why this was the case, often the answer was, well, you know, we want to make impact on policymaking, and therefore we're primarily looking at sort of national transitions. And there's a lot to be said for, you know, the impact of national policy making, but as maybe as an unintended consequence of that strong focus on national transitions, I think foundational theorizations around sustainability transitions were a bit elusive when it comes to using spatial metaphors. And I mean, this is already sort of in the initial sort of writings around the MLP and the different levels, and how people also sort of started to conflate these levels with scales, and also just sort of a sort of an intuitive use of concepts such as global and local, which not really actually had a sort of strong spatial substantiation. And that was also not the intention, you know, with credit to the defense of the authors at that time. But for geographers, it was very confusing to sort of see all these sort of spatial terms popping up, but without really a proper engagement with space, scale, and place. So when we started to engage with sustainability transitions, And together with some colleagues like Bernard Ruffer, Paul Bennyworth, we sort of saw there was a real lack of spatial sensitivity in this literature. There was methodological nationalism, and this could be very problematic because a typical transition study would then sort of take the national system as its sort of point of departure, and without really acknowledging what would be going on outside the country. And that is particularly sort of problematic in view of how the world looked like in present, with processes of globalization happening, but at the same time, also things like we're increasingly seeing urbanization shaping our world. Even though you could say maybe now in this sort of COVID-19 era, we see parts of those processes also being reversed. So even though a lot of the sort of, again, the theories of sustainability transitions were based on historical analysis, some of those sort of frameworks could not really sort of account for perhaps contemporary phenomenon like globalization. And finally, when it comes to the governance of sustainability transitions, I would say that a lot of these sort of the foundational ideas were a bit sort of one size fits all and very much sort of based on, say, the political economy and sort of Dutch styles of governance and policy making, leading to relatively blunt and naive policy repertoires. So that, together with a whole range of geographers at that time, there was really sort of quite some momentum to start building up a geography of transitions agenda. And together with Bernard, we've published a number of papers, both in sort of transitions journals, but also in geography journals, where we try to sort of sketch out this agenda, which basically is kind of constructed around four main themes. The first being to understand whether and why transitions unfold unevenly across space, to analyze whether and how context matters from transition processes, to analyze how the spatial dimensions of networks, both local or global, influence transition processes, and to analyze the governance of transitions at and across different scales. And that engagement with geography brought also some particular analytical tools to the field of sustainability transitions. We could really see that there was an increased sort of uptake of studies that really looked at sort of the place-based characteristics of transitions, acknowledging that institutions have particular sort of territorial qualities, and that there can be sort of a territorial coherence of why you find particular institutional regimes in certain countries or in certain cities or regions. And personally, I'm very sort of influenced by the varieties of capitalism literature as a way to sort of understand how these different territorial coherences play out in different countries. Similarly, that capabilities, knowledge, technologies for sustainability transitions can often be very place-based, and that their evolution also has has proximity effects, and that sort of is very much sort of coming to the fore in the work on related variety and diversification of technologies in particular regions and localities. Then I think what has been a major contribution coming from the geography transitions is that it's really sort of taken the whole idea of a global perspective much more serious than in sort of previous theorizations of sustainability transitions. And I think especially the paper by Christian Binns and Bernard Ruffer from 2017 really sort of lays out a very kind of comprehensive framework how to really look at a global technological innovation system, and how that sort of has particular sort of, again, agglomerations or centers in particular parts of the world, and why is that the case? Another aspect that, or an analytical tool that the geography of transitions has sort of brought to the table is that it has very much sort of strengthened a more comparative perspective on sustainability transitions, comparing between countries, and comparing between regions, and doing that in a sort of a systematic way. I think one of the methodological challenges of sustainability transitions is that we are not studying a historical transition. We are studying a transition that is unfolding as we speak. And the MLP has very much drawn on those sort of historical analysis to, to understand how these sort of processes unfold over time. And we don't have that sort of same advantage now with contemporary low carbon transitions, and therefore understanding why transitions unfold differently across space can be a complementary methodological sort of added value. Then it's probably also fair to say that in sustainability transitions, there's a really strong focus on case studies and a lot of qualitative research, even though, again, that is simplifying the picture a little bit. But again, I think what geographers and the geography of transitions have really sort of brought to the table is also a much more focus on quantitative spatial analysis. And finally, I'd like to mention some of the work that especially has been happening in the urban sphere, and I know Nikki has already done an excellent job in laying that out, around local action research and living labs, and how a lot of geography of sustainability transitions has also sort of really drawn on the sort of the personal, the inter-organizational relationships with local governments, with local stakeholders, not just sort of to study those transitions in context, but also to actively sort of accelerate them. Now, what have been then some of the outcomes of the spatial turn in sustainability transitions? And this is slightly dated. This is kind of a slide that goes back to a literature review that Thijs Hansen and myself conducted in 2015, where we wanted to take stock with what's going on with the geography of sustainability transitions. And it's fair to say that a lot of the contributions that came from geographers and from scholars engaging with this thematic debunked the idea that transitions sort of happen naturally on a national level. And it also sort of it raised attention for a range of sort of neglected topics. For example, the importance of urban and regional visions and policies for sustainability transitions, how there are very important local industry dynamics playing out in, say, technological innovation systems, not on a national level, but distinctly on subnational levels or on global levels. How market formations for sustainability transitions are supported by proximity advantages, the importance of natural resource availability to explain for why sustainability transitions happen in certain places and not in others, and of course the idea that transitions unfold across multiple scales. I'd probably refer much more to the paper if you want to really get a sense of what these individual papers really have to say. But what our review also sort of concluded was that there was primarily a concern with, so to say, niche dimensions of sustainability transitions and sort of formative phases of technological innovation systems, if you like. So very much sort of this emphasis on the creation of novelty, the creation, the acceleration of transitions, and far less concern with the spatialities and the geographies of regimes, even though, for example, recent work by Leah and Christian has already sort of started to engage also with the spatiality of regimes. What we also concluded was that the spatial perspective was primarily layered on top of existing sort of theories, frameworks, and empirical insights from the transitions fields. And therefore, it was still a little bit sort of difficult to say, so, to what extent and how does geography and place specificity matter? And this is a famous sort of Achilles heel for geographers. We tend to be very good at saying, geography matters. You have to really look at sort of how local conditions influence something. But for non-geographers, they were like, yeah, so what? Okay, space matters, but can you tell me a little bit more of, what I can learn about, local context matters in my particular research. So I think that's also where we are currently sort of standing, moving to the sort of the future outlook in the geography of sustainability transitions. We're in a sense sort of in the middle of a debate around whether the geography of sustainability transitions is primarily a topical concern, an empirical concern, or whether there's sort of a deeper theoretical engagement. The latest version of the STRN agenda, published in NEST, primarily sort of focused on empirical topics. That we really need to focus on urban sustainability transitions. That is a very important topic, and at sustainability transitions in developing countries, in the global south, in emerging economies. And well, some of us were, including myself, thought, well, yes, that is important, but it's also important to really sort of ask some more theoretical questions. And we sort of wrote a commentary then in ACE, where we, for example, argued that there's a lot to be gained in terms of insights about the geography of transitions and about transitions in general by drawing on concepts from evolutionary economic geography. Notions of related and unrelated diversification and how that can explain why transitions happen in certain regions more quickly than in others. I think another sort of to really sort of stay in the contemporary, an important aspect that for the geographies of transition really lies in engaging what is happening right now in sort of the post-COVID-19 world, where in transition studies, we have a lot of interest in the notion of experimentation, policy experimentation, socio-technical experimentation. And I think, the external landscape shock called COVID-19 provides a lot of very interesting empirical material to really engage with how such sort of experimentations play out, and also how experimentation is sort of contingent on place and space. So we really see countries and cities responding differently to this pandemic, sort of creating responses on the go, while at the same time, very much sort of being conditioned by existing capabilities, existing institutions, and so on. So I think when you are interested in sort of the geography of experiments and experimentation, this is, in a sense, a very good time. But also to sort of really take seriously what Anthony Giddens calls that this is the first digidemic. This is the first time that sort of the world faces a pandemic, while we are also in a sort of advanced state of digitalization. So even though we cannot travel, we are currently very much connected through ICT technologies. And in many ways, the world has become sort of smaller, but also bigger. And again, that is, to me, a topic that hasn't really been addressed a lot in sustainability transitions, is the other transformation that is going on in the world around digitization, and especially how that digitization is affecting the geography of transitions. Thirdly, is perhaps a stronger engagement with the geography of sustainability in sustainability transitions. I think sustainability transitions is pretty, well equipped to explain and understand transitions. But again, sort of an Achilles heel is, so what does this really say about the sustainability of these transitions? And there's a risk also that not taking this serious will really sort of backfire how these transitions are going to unfold. For example, in innovation studies and in sort of geography innovation, there's really, I think, an interesting and promising area of research around the geographies of discontent. Again, sort of the ever so speeding up of the economy and accelerated innovation in our economies, and how that is also creating a lot of sort of losers, to not say it mean this in a sort of denigrating way, but sort of acknowledging that in an innovation-fueled economy, there are winners and losers. And increasingly, we start to realize that those regions and those communities at the losing end are, for example, shifting towards a sort of populist politics to articulate their resistance. And I think that sort of resonates also with calls by transition scholars around that we have to take the notion of just transition much more seriously, the social sustainability of sustainability transitions. In that sort of reflexive spirit, I think there would be, as in innovation studies, there's increased interest in the dark side of innovation. We would do very well looking at the dark side of sustainability transitions, the left behinds, also the negative effects of, for example, all kinds of responses to shifting to low carbon for other environmental problems. And finally, and this has already been mentioned here at NEST by Giuseppe Fiola, how sustainability transitions really relate to global capitalism and alternative economies. And I think there is sort of an understanding, a reliance in sustainability transitions that we sort of, by fostering transitions, by fostering sustainable innovation, societies sort of benefit from this, of course, by greening the economy, but also through sort of trickle-down effects, focusing on sort of the growth of clean tech industries. But at the same time, that is sort of still reproducing a very uneven global economy, and it is questionable whether sort of that lack of social cohesion, that sort of territorial disparity, whether that is sustainable also when we green the economy. So I think there would be a lot of scope to much more engage also with sort of, for sustainability transitions research, with alternative local economies. And finally, I think there's a real scope to do research on, say, the spatial variation in the implementation of transition policy. So we can see that transition concepts are becoming increasingly mainstreamed in policy and practice. Think about, mission-oriented innovation policy, smart specialization. They all start to increasingly sort of take on board ideas and concepts from transitions fields. But at the same time, sort of policy design is not the same as policy implementation. And I think it's very interesting for the geography of transitions to look at how the implementation of transition policy looks differently in different regions and different countries. So how different countries implement mission-oriented innovation policy, and likewise how different regions implement sustainable smart specialization strategies contingent on their sort of institutional preconditions and their existing capabilities. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. I very much hope there are some questions and debate. And just to kind of conclude, to draw your attention to an ongoing webinar series that Christian Binz, Bernard Schruffer, and James Murphy and myself are organizing, where we're trying to bring together conversations between geographers and sustainability transitions scholars. And again, also there, a lot of the webinars have been recorded and are available on this website. All right, thanks very much.